All right, ladies and gentlemen, hello and welcome back once again to the only coast-to-coast radio show all about the information economy, inside analysis. Yours truly, Eric Kavanagh, here with Rafi Kurlansik. He is with Databricks. He's a machine learning expert. I checked out your resume. You've done a lot of cool things over the years.
Thank you.
And, data science, it's so interesting. I remember the beginning, sort of the dawn of data science, you could argue, was maybe 10, 15 years ago. I come from the data warehousing world, so that's a bit longer ago. 25 years ago is when I got into it, I'm afraid to admit. It's been a long time. And then data science comes along and really tackles some of the meatier, really dense topics, life sciences, healthcare, things of this nature, where you have incredibly high dimensionality of data, all sorts of facets and permutations and things, not so neat and clean like product widget sales or something that fits neatly into a data warehouse. And data science obviously has done amazing things. There's some really cool data science platforms. But one thing I love about Databricks is that you've really sought to democratize data science and to, I think, demystify it. And now with this AI, BI, Genie, and some of these other things, the ML flow, all these different products are making it very easy to do what was an incredibly complex and difficult thing. And I think that's been one of the big holdups in data science, is that it's just been so hard. And I think in some cases, the data science team kind of went up into its ivory tower, and the business side was, oh, we don't really know what those people do. And that's not what you want. You want the business to understand and to be able to leverage this. So tell us what you've done recently. I mean, I've tracked it myself, but it seems like there's a lot going on to spread the value of data science.
Yeah. So I actually think that Databricks has always, from the very beginning, from its inception, has been about democratizing access to data and AI. And it's really expressed, like the kernel of that was with Apache Spark. So Apache Spark grew out of the Hadoop ecosystem, which was a very complex ecosystem. And Spark's big innovation was that it could be an in-memory execution engine, as opposed to having to do something like MapReduce, where you have writing to files like in the middle of a job, just so that you can actually like compute something like an average or something like that. So Michael Armbrust actually was talking about this today in the keynote, how Spark started off with RDDs, and then it went to Spark SQL, and then it got even simpler and simpler. So the other big thing with Spark was that it had a very broad API, meaning you could do, with a single engine, you could do machine learning, you could do SQL data engineering, and you could do analytics, you could do advanced forms of machine learning, other different things. So unifying all of that while also trying to simplify something, which at the time you were going from something complex in Hadoop to something simpler in Spark. But then over time, if you look back, like Spark was still pretty complex, so it continued to get simpler from there. And I think that over time, Databricks realized, like, okay, well, we have the engine, but it's not complete unless you also have like the storage layer, and that's where Delta Lake came in to bring ACID transactions to the data lake. And now you have a unification or a simplification between data lakes and data warehouses. So you can govern, and sorry, not just govern, but like you can work with structured and unstructured data using one storage format and one engine. So that's like, okay, you're getting simpler, but it's still for engineering minded people who know how to write code and everything like that. And I've been at Databricks for 6.5 years, and I've just noticed that it's been very consistently going towards simplification. And I think that this year's conference was a pretty big moment for that, by having things like AI BI, where like now you can have, it's simpler than ever because you can use natural language to create a data pipeline. But under the hood, it's actually building it on top of the Spark and Delta and like all these things that were and are extremely powerful. For years only accessible to like engineers or data engineers, data scientists, but now it's really becoming accessible to anybody. So yeah.
And that's awesome. And if you look at the advances, like you mentioned, natural language processing, being able to speak to the machines in natural language. Because before you had to learn how to talk computer. You had to use the language of the computer, SQL or Python or whatever the case may be. Now, I mean, these LLMs can write Python, they can write Java, they can write all kind of stuff. And if the business users can just articulate what they're trying to understand, I mean, some of the demos we saw today, like around the marketing, were fantastic, where you can not only ask what happened, but you can ask why it happened.
Yeah.
And that's when you really start getting to the depth of analysis and understanding a business. Well, why did this happen? How can we improve this? Give me a plan for improving our conversion rates, for
Yeah.
example. Because once, and here's the thing, I was talking to several people about this today. One of the attendees who was blown away. I said, when things are very difficult to achieve, there's a lot of friction. And so you really have to force projects through and kind of make yourself work on it. But when it's fluid and open and you can just ask questions, all of a sudden you will start trying new ideas. You have the confidence to ask the harder questions and to dig deeper. And I think that's the key here for long-term success with democratization of data science is to make it easy, but still deterministic, still have these underpinnings of what you have with Apache Spark and these other technologies on top of it. That's the holy grail in a sense, right?
I think so. I think a lot of the limitations now are not so much with, to your point, we have the natural language interface. Like that's already basically been solved. You can talk to machines,
Right.
And they'll understand English perfectly well, and they can generate code. They can translate your English into computer language. So that's not really the issue. I think the issue is more, in order to make it successful, you need to make sure that the context is sufficient to answer that question.
Right.
That's the big challenge, right? And for our customers, that means they have data about their business and they have like a glossary of like the terms, and those two things may live in very different places.
Right.
Like the data may live in tables and Databricks or somewhere else. And then the glossary might be like in a Word file in somebody's,
Right.
like in a shared folder or something like that. But in order to be able to get a good answer to your question, you need to have both of those things.
Right.
So I think that's a lot of work is going into bridging that gap,
Right.
and making it so that you can ask questions to figure out why something is happening or
Right.
what's been going on. And Databricks is building the system that like you can put all of that context there, and then you'll be able to get a good answer from it.
Right. Well, and I was also very impressed with this vision of Unity Catalog and the fact that it's free, because, I mean, I've been around in this business a long time, and I remember 20 years ago talking about data governance. And 20 years ago, data governance was kind of a wish. You might have a policy somewhere that sat in a manual on a shelf that someone may have read or may not have read, but there was really no way to enforce it. I mean, you could enforce database access, but at scale, that's a very difficult mechanism of action. You could enforce it perhaps at the dashboard level, and that's also okay, it works, but nothing in the middle. And the other side of the equation is if you aren't able to encapsulate everything, if your umbrella doesn't touch everything, then you're really not governing that much at all. Because if someone can go around your governance policies, well, you're no longer governing. Your
Right.
governance is no longer valid.
Right.
And if you're talking about data science, you need that data to be governed. You need that data to
Right.
be certified, to be in good condition, not perfect, doesn't have to be perfect, but close to perfect is what you want. So to me, this kind of brings the robustness of the vision to the table and solves a lot of problems,
Yes.
right?
Yeah. Unity Catalog is it's essential because for data science, it's true you need tables, but you also need files. You need like purely unstructured data. Like what if you're working with audio or
Right.
video or things like that? Like at the end of the day, you need to store and govern. So you need to store data that's not in a tabular format, but you also want to govern it. You want to secure it. So I think Unity Catalog is pretty brilliant at viewing it that way, right? And so it's a governance layer that goes across all different kinds of assets beyond just tables. And I think that really helps a lot. Which also brings me to another point I wanted to mention, which is that I think one of the things that Databricks has done really well and it makes it unique is that and differentiates it from BI to other BI tools and other data science tools is that it's built the core engine and governance as like a foundation, and then all the data science tooling and BI tooling exists on top of that in the same platform,
Right.
as opposed to, you have your data and your processing living over here, your main like data processing over here, and then you have your data science tool over here.
Right.
And when you fire up your data science tool, you have to import your
Right.
data over here. And the same with BI, right? So what that does is it basically like cuts off. It's like, okay, I can make an API call and I can like pull some data in,
Right.
but it's not really like a live connection or a native integration or anything like that. So I think that is what a lot of the other companies that you mentioned at the beginning, I think that that's going to be a really hard problem for them.
Yeah.
Because it's increasingly as Databricks, over time continues to reach feature parity with those other products,
Right.
then the argument is just gonna be like, well, why wouldn't you just
Right.
want everything in one place?
Right. Right. Well, and all the data movement too. I remember when I launched our first radio show, DM Radio, back in 2008, I had been in the business for about 7 years on the data warehousing side, and I'd wrap my head around ETL and batch windows. And you can just imagine over time, the data warehouse got more popular, more people wanted to get their data into it. And so there's a lot of pressure on the data teams, and the batch windows went from overnight to all day and all night, and became a fairly brittle environment. And you were moving so much data around and around, day after day after day,
Right.
often moving data, I would argue, unnecessarily, because it wasn't even being used on the other end in the analytics. So I did notice several speakers today talk a lot about pay for consumption, pay for use. Don't pay if you're not using this stuff. Well, that's what the business wants. You don't want to have to pay for a big honking data warehouse if you're
Yeah.
not going to be using it very much. So that's a key part of the strategy, I think, to control
Absolutely.
costs and optimize usage, I think. What do you think?
No, I totally agree. The one thing that's always stuck with me from Ali Kodsi, like the CEO, talking about how like the strategy and how Databricks positions itself. You have one copy of the data,
Right.
right?
Right.
You don't need to copy it out to another tool,
Right.
just so that you can do some task like analyze it in a specific way. You have one copy of the data, it's in an open format, and you have data science, data engineering, analytics tools, all working on that one copy of the data governed by UC. That's the whole big idea. And increasingly, some of the announcements that Matei was making today were very interesting, because he was basically saying, hey, now you can use DuckDB like outside of Databricks, and you can query that one copy of data, and you will be able to it'll respect all the access controls and everything like that.
That's
So,
crazy.
Yeah, it is. I don't even know how they did that, to be honest. But yeah, so it's kind of interesting how like now that they built that like really solid foundation, now they can start to do really cool things.
Right. Right.
On top of that.
Well, so one of my mantras that I've been talking about for, gosh, the last year or two, as AI becomes more pervasive, as companies look to leverage AI, and not just Gen AI, there's all this old-fashioned AI and machine learning, which is
that's super important.
It's very, very important. And in many cases, it's much more applicable to particular use cases. So, you have to know which tech to use in which circumstance, depending upon your desired outcome. But my point was that if a company wants to really embrace AI and become AI ready, you have to get your data house in order. You cannot have this sprawling mess that you don't fully understand with multiple copies here and there. And in the hybrid cloud world, that's a real problem, because you got stuff all over the place. And to have that single pane of glass that is allowing you to see into all those environments, that's crucial, because then you can start to chip away and make sure you're refining what you have, getting it to the point where it is AI ready. That's when you can start really getting a lot of bang for your buck with AI, right?
Yeah, definitely. I think we will see more over time how Databricks will try to. This is my personal prediction here. This is not it's not official company stuff, but I do think that we'll see an abstraction on top of the hyperscalers, because why should you care? Like if your data is over here or over there, like it should just be you should be able to access it from a single place and govern it from a single place. And I think that the foundation is kind of being put in place to do that.
Yeah.
So we'll see where that goes. But I agree with you in terms of your conclusion.
Well, and so getting back to data science as a practice, as a discipline, what I think is so fascinating is that, well, Well, maybe I'll throw this one at you. I had this theory a few years ago. I gave a talk at a keynote. I guess it was about 5, 6 years ago now. As AI was really taking off, you have data warehouse, enterprise data warehouse, and you have AI systems. And the theory that I came up with was, in a way, this is like your left eye and your right eye, and you need two eyes to have depth perception. Right? If you only have one eye, then you don't have depth perception.
Yeah.
And I think, in a way, that metaphor kind of holds that the data science is filling in gaps that the data warehouse cannot provide, but the data warehouse provides that trusted, deterministic, certified view of the world. So they're both necessary. You don't want to choose one or the other. You ideally want both. But what do you think about that?
I agree with you. I see it a little differently though. I think about it more in terms of the types of questions that you're asking. So I think, although the worlds are kind of blurring a little bit. So let me explain what I mean. Like, on the one hand, SQL as language is very, very good for, aggregating data and understanding what has happened, right? So what were my sales, last quarter or whatever. And data science is very good at modeling the existing data that you have so that you can predict, if I had new information, like what would the outcome be, right? So you can ask questions like, well, what would happen? What's the future look like?
Right.
But the reason I say that, and so typically those have been kind of separate domains because you had data science really coming up in open source. There were some, you had SaaS and like some proprietary stuff for sure, but data science really obviously kind of open source won the day there, I think. But then you had SQL was more associated with data warehousing and data analytics and stuff like that. But I do think that they're converging very quickly because you have the ability now in Databricks to register functions in SQL, and you can register a function in Unity Catalog that you can call in SQL that will actually pass data to a model that you trained in Python. So I can say like, I can have a forecasting model.
Yeah, go ahead.
I can have a forecasting model in Python and I can expose it to people in SQL. So the worlds are kind of, merging.
Yeah, and that's good stuff. Folks, we'll be right back. Don't touch that dial. You're listening to Inside Analysis. All right, folks, back here on Inside Analysis, talking to Rafi Kurlansik of Databricks here at the Data and AI Summit in San Francisco. And you reminded me of something. I'm glad you did, because I wanted to ask you about this. One of the things I've noticed over the last probably like 8, 10 years is that you would have a data warehousing team in a big company and you'd have a data science team, and they wouldn't even really talk to each other. Which is like, oh, why is that happening? And I think it's because they just roll up to different places, perhaps. The data science folks are dealing with, like I said before, some real meaty issues, whereas data warehousing is usually focused on sales and how much it costs and what our profit margins are and the sort of basic deterministic stuff of the business. But you don't want these to be different worlds. You want these folks talking to each other. And I think Databricks is one of the real leaders in trying to cater to both of those audiences, understanding you're all using the same data.
Right.
So if you have this unification of the data platform, of the data layer, now we're all on the same page. And whatever conclusions we draw, it's coming from the same data. That's governance. That fosters accuracy, because I'm sure you know as well as I do, in the business world, if a business user gets data from a data warehouse or a data science team and it turns out to be wrong, they don't want to touch it anymore.
Oh, right.
It's like, if that's not really, really highly accurate, they're like, they just walk away because they don't want to risk anything. So I think that there finally is a strong awareness that these worlds need to come together and become two peas in a pod. What do you think?
I think that they have been separate because of two reasons. One is what you said with the you usually have just like different organizations, like arrangements. So you have like a director of data science and a director of data warehousing.
Right.
They have their own teams and everything like that. But then also just the tooling and the technologies were also just disparate. They were separated.
Right.
So I really like what you're saying, that basically like by unifying the technologies, you kind of also bring the people together.
Right.
And yeah, and one way that expresses itself is in what I was just saying before the break about AI functions, or basically, or just the ability to register any arbitrary Python function in Unity catalog and expose it through SQL.
Right.
That's extremely powerful because now instead of the data science team being sort of like either competitive or just disconnected from the data analyst or data warehousing team, the data analyst team can benefit from the work directly, and they can work much more closely together.
Right.
Yeah.
That's what you want.
Yeah. And then what's also really cool is that those functions, you don't even have to know that function exists.
Right.
So what I mean by that is, like, let's say I'm using AI/BI now in Databricks, and I ask a question about a forecast or something like that. The system will know, like, oh, well, there's this function over here in Unity catalog that has a description that fits what this person's asking for.
Right.
So I'm going to incorporate that into the SQL that I'm generating to create this answer.
Right.
And that's all just happening behind the scenes. And you're using natural language.
Right.
So it goes beyond just unifying the data scientists and the data analysts. It's like even the completely, like, people who don't know any code.
Right.
Like, you're able to benefit from that.
Yeah, that's so cool because, over the years, one of the big challenges has been reports and dashboards, and this proliferation of reports and dashboards.
Yeah.
One team will spin it up because someone asked for it, and then they set it on autopilot, and every week or every day or every so often it runs. How many of those are being used? And you wind up recreating the wheel again and again and again.
Yeah.
And what's so interesting to me is that this natural language query, again, if you are in the same environment, is so powerful because it kind of obviates that problem now. You don't have to worry about that. And when you have stuff in the background kind of tracking what's where, then that it solves the problem for the business user to not have to sort of track down, where is this, where is that? How would I understand this part of the business, for example? That solved problem, I think, is just massive for usability and for confidence, right?
Yeah, I mean, you can still just to be fair here, you can still have your Databricks workspace, very cluttered and, like, not
Right.
It can be hard to know exactly what to use.
Right.
So I'm actually dealing with that right now, and after this show, I'm going to go talk to somebody about that to make sure I can get the right data. So
Right.
nevertheless, the capabilities are there to make that much clearer, and I think that's a problem that we're still solving and working on. And they made announcements about that today about the whole, like, new Discover page, and trying to solve exactly what you're talking about. Like, you shouldn't have to root around
Right.
for
Right.
this version of this data
Because it's wasted time. It's wasted time, and you
Yeah.
wind up with the wrong answer sometimes.
and duplicative effort. People wind up building the same thing.
Right. I do want to get into one of my favorite topics here, and our Ali Ghodsi was talking about a lot today, the LLMs, and they hallucinate, and that's a real problem. Like, we don't want hallucinations, and I do think it's kind of fascinating that in the data world, the information systems world, we spent the last 50 years really perfecting and improving the foundation, which was a database, making it faster, more performant, more concurrent users, more connectors, all these things. But one thing was never in question, that was quality, but accuracy. You would get out what you put in,
Oh, for sure.
period. Like,
Yeah.
no questions
It was
asked.
deterministic.
Right,
Yeah.
deterministic. And now you take this probabilistic
Yeah.
engine, you throw it at the end of that supply chain, like, wait a minute, it's like a noise filter at the very end. I was like, why would we do that?
Yeah.
And the answer, of course, is that it's very powerful, and, like, this storytelling ability is amazing. So how do you get closer and closer? Because 80% is usually what they say is the sort of out of the box accuracy. And I ask people, okay, what part of your business could be wrong 20% of the time?
Right.
The answer is, well, no,
Yeah.
basically. So inching closer to 95, 97, 99. One of the cooler companies I've come across called Data Squared, a bunch of ex-military guys, they use a knowledge graph. So they'll have, you have your enterprise data down here, they build a knowledge graph on top of that. Then you have, like, MCP, model context protocol, and then you have the LLM. That strikes me as a very nice stack, because the graph captures all these relationships between entities, and that's a very rich piece of context for the LLM to use, right? So is there a graph component in the Databricks world, in that stack?
I believe so, under the hood. Yeah. I'm not personally familiar with the implementation, but just from talking to some of the product managers, I believe that is
Right.
part of the mix. Yeah.
Well, a DAG is at the cornerstone, right? It's
Yeah.
the directed acyclic graph, right?
Yeah, yeah,
And
yeah.
it just
Oh,
basically
for sure. I mean,
scans all these, scans what you have and figures out how to parallelize it, right?
yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Exactly. I want to add on to what you're saying though, and actually, I was going to bring this up earlier, but now I'm glad you reminded me. So I think that the after working with language models a lot in the past like 6 months, building useful things for them with them for internal use. What I've noticed is if you're casual with a language model, it will, kind of be casual with you. Like it'll give you, it'll give you its best answer, whatever.
Right.
But if you are, if you're very precise, the better the language model, the more it will respect the precision which you
Really?
speak. Yeah. So for example, if you have like, let's say you have a blob of text, like a questionnaire or something like that, and you want to parse this questionnaire, or you have like a huge bunch of product reviews or something like that, and you want to transform that into some pretty structured summaries and classifications and like all this kind of stuff, and you want it to be in a certain format. The more precise you are in describing exactly what you want and how you want the output and giving it examples,
Wow.
the better the results are. It still is probabilistic, but what I've noticed is that as models get better, they get better at respecting precision.
Wow.
Yeah. So it's sort of I would say to people out there, like, you'd be surprised at how far you can push the models that exist today just by being extremely precise in your own thinking and your own articulation of what you want.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's pretty cool.
Yeah. So like if you're using ChatGPT and you're like using it instead of Google and you're just asking a question, then, sure, be casual. But if you're trying to basically do a form of ETL using natural language, then the more precise you can be, the better
Right.
the better the results will be.
That's fascinating. And these different models, they can learn amazing things. I mean, but you have to be careful training them too. So I often joke that training an AI model is kind of like raising a kid. You have to be careful what you expose it to, because if you, for example, curse in front of your 2-year-old, well,
Right.
don't be surprised if your 2-year-old curses back.
Yes.
And that's your fault
For sure.
because you gave it, you
sure.
filled the model, right? It's very hard
Yeah.
to unlearn things too. Like that's the other challenge. It's like once it's in there, it's kind of hard to get that out of there, right? So that's an interesting challenge. What do you think about a model context protocol? I've never seen a technology take off so fast. Like all of a sudden there are hundreds of MCP servers. Everyone and their grandmother has an MCP server. That is a key component because I think it helps cohesively connect your data to the LLM. What
Yeah.
do you think?
Yeah, and I mean, my understanding, I haven't worked too much with MCP, even though I've worked a lot with language models. My understanding is essentially like you can swap out the model, but you have a description of all of the different tools or APIs that the model can
Right.
access.
Right.
And I think it's very exciting. I think that there again, like the precision matters a lot.
Right.
I would say again, even as someone who's not really played around that much with MCP, my intuition at this point tells me that if you're struggling with it, be more precise in how you describe each of the different tools and each of the different
That's interesting.
APIs. Yeah.
Well, the other really cool thing here is I've appreciated for a long time that different programming languages are like different languages. English, French, German. It's not just a one-to-one map
No, it's not.
of definitions and semantics, right? And so there are different ways that these things operate. And what's cool now is that not only can an LLM spin up some code for you, you can ask it what that code means. You can ask it all kinds of questions like, well, I want to accomplish X, Y, Z. Should I write that in Python or R, and why?
Yeah.
And you'll get this really rich explanation. I mean,
Absolutely. Yeah.
I had a guy, David Linthicum, one of my favorite people on the show. He's a great cloud analyst. He's a big data. He's been around for years, AI. And he referred to it as a very efficient rabbit hole that you can go down, because you can just dive into this thing and you come back hours later with all kinds of information.
Yeah.
So it's just wild. It's like education on demand.
Yeah.
And you do have to check things, and the more fringe oriented the topic is, the looser it gets.
Yeah.
But for anything that's been widely published about like how this programming language works or that programming language works, because it's a consensus engine, really, when you get down to it, right?
Interesting. Interesting. What do you mean by that?
Well, so in other words, an LLM will give you the average of everything that it's seen on that topic.
Okay.
So if you ask it, how does a radiator work, for example, lots and lots of publications about how radiators work.
Yeah.
And the way it vectorizes is it takes, well, tokens really, but they all, like the cat as a token will be similar. Every kind of use of the word cat will be similar in the same area of the vector landscape. So it's giving you this average. That's why I call it a consensus
Oh, I
engine,
see. I see.
right? It's sort of, okay, I've seen this, and that. Here's the average of what I've seen. So that's why you want your creativity on top of it instead of kind of relying on it to be creative for you, because it's really
for
just giving you the average of what it's seen.
For sure, for sure. I think so. Maybe this goes along with what I was saying before about precision, that like if you use a language model to substitute for your own thinking,
Right.
then
That's not its
you're-
purpose,
you're
right?
well, and you'll probably eventually get left behind,
Right.
because it will continue to get smarter and smarter, and
Right.
you never learned anything.
Right.
But if you use it to help research, it's an incredible tool to like accelerate research and learning.
Right.
So if you use it to enrich your own knowledge, and then in turn you become better at asking questions
Right.
and directing it, that becomes like a positive feedback
Wow.
loop, as opposed to like the worst case is like, oh, write this paper for me.
Right.
Like you're doing yourself the worst disservice.
Right.
Because
That's
writing
right.
is articulating your thoughts, right?
Right.
And crystallizing your thoughts. And
Right.
by asking an LLM to write for you is and you're just taking your brain out of the picture.
Right.
So I think that's a bad path. But the other path of using it to learn and then ask better questions and kind of it's your
Right.
partner, it's your sparring partner in thinking.
Right.
That's very, very good.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, it is going to be very interesting to see where this all goes. I mean, a lot of people talk about the snake eating its tail. There is something to be said for that. I worry a little bit about content creators and kind of losing some of the value of going out there and creating your content. I mean, there are legal issues, there are all kinds of things going on, but bottom line is the cat's out of the bag.
Yeah.
They're all over the place. And the more you use these things, the more you play around with them, the better off you're going to be. Final thoughts from you.
Just to well, just to summarize a few things. I think Databricks has always been trying to unify data and AI and make it accessible. And I think that we're getting to a point where it's going to explode and become like just extremely available.
Right.
And I think human pursuits, cultivating your personality, yourself, like growing yourself is going to become very important, and human interactions are going to become very, very important, because a lot of the things that we spend time doing are things that a machine can do.
Right.
So it's going to become kind of a big question of like, what will we do with ourselves? We have good answers for that, but
Right.
it'll be a journey to get there, I think.
Yeah, I think so too. Well, look this gentleman up online, Rafi Kurlansik of Databricks. Stand by. We'll be right back. You're listening to Inside Analysis. All right, folks, back here on Inside Analysis, talking to Mikey Watson from Monks. We've been talking about agentic use cases and AI, how to use it, when to use it, what to do with it, what cool things it does. And one of the fun aspects of all this is we don't even know yet all the things it can do. We're experimenting right now, finding out the things it can do, and it'll blow your mind on a daily basis. But Mikey, you had mentioned wanted to talk about creative and metrics. How do you measure creativity? And really what you're measuring is the efficacy of a certain creative, of a certain ad, of a certain video, of a certain podcast. How good of traction do you get? How good engagement do you get? What does that look like? That's like super really important stuff that we kind of haven't been able to do very well until recently. I mean, some of the more well-equipped companies have been able to do that, but now with this new AI capability, you can really fine-tune the measurements of creative value, right? Tell us about that.
Yeah, and I think you're on the money there. We've seen Meta, we've seen Google doing this for a period of time, and I think a level playing field is probably the term that I would use now with some of the cloud computing elements that are out there. And really what's been insightful for us is at Monks, if you think about our legacy, we're a legacy creative organization. We dabble in data, we do a lot of performance analysis. And I think what's really been transformational for us is some of the advances in computer vision, and putting it bluntly, dissecting some of the creatives, understanding the elements in there, and I think going back to our previous conversation, we were talking about the rise of metadata, and this is what's really been interesting for us is you can start to dissect these creatives, understand not only sentiment, but some of the features inside of a creative, whether people are being shown, whether they're showing some form of positivity, some negativity around it. I think
Right.
one really interesting example, we were working for a mattress company of all companies, and if you think about their core product, a lot of the images or the creatives that were being shown is there's people sleeping in them. And beforehand, it was very difficult to understand, well, what is actually performing? We could do a very top-down analysis and say creative A was performing really well from our media logs, our outputs, but we weren't able to get to that atomic kind of unit of saying, well, what in the creative is performing well. So we started to essentially look at some of those atomic elements, and we actually noticed something really interesting is like some of the creative that wasn't performing too great was people were smiling whilst they were sleeping, and we came up with the hypothesis that a lot of people don't typically smile when they're sleeping. And that was presenting kind of a negative sentiment with the audience. There was less engagement. We could tie this to some of the metrics. And this was only possible by running through kind of a pre-trained model, understanding those elements, creating a meta data layer against it, and linking that back up to the performance data that we saw, clicks, engagements, and further transactions through. I think so. Applying those concepts really to a broader swath of creative is really the starting point to start to truly understand what is going on. But then secondly,
Mhm.
start to piece that information together to start to inform how you might create new creative on the back of it. And then secondly, as we were talking about agentic and really finding out where we're going, the whole image generation side of things becomes very, very appealing for a large scale kind of creative shop. Ideally, bringing out those elements and starting to tune different models, starting to
Right.
concept different features that you've extracted from the data or from your unstructured
Right.
data and pairing it with your performance. So super
Right.
interesting from our perspective there.
Well, sure. And I've been in the ad business for longer than I care to admit. And I remember like getting custom photos of different scenes used to be really expensive. You want to talk about an industry that has been upended. Now, like anyone can do that. Now, it doesn't mean the designer goes away. It's very important to understand this, folks. What it means is that designers who are doing a good job are going to leverage this technology to iterate faster and to get closer to the fine point that you want. Because I mean, I've been in creative for a long, long time, like 35 years. Like right out of college, I went for a newspaper, and that's the creative industry. It's news, but you have to write stuff, take pictures, all that fun stuff. And so I know how hard it is to do that stuff. And you never know what's going to work until you see the traction. Sometimes you can think, oh, this is going to be great, and it's a dud. Sometimes you think, this is not so good, and it just takes off. But let the data tell you what's happening. And, there is this issue of normalizing the data, of understanding what's real, what's a bot, what's manufactured. There's a lot of that stuff out there too. So we're going to be spending time kind of sussing through all that stuff. But the most important fact is the human remains in the loop. The designer is still important. It's just that they can work faster thanks to this technology, right, Mikey?
Absolutely, couldn't have said it better myself. And I think it's more of the level playing field that we were talking about. It's not just the extreme advanced technology companies out there that are able to do this now. And it's opening the door to even probably more opportunities from the creative space, from my perspective. If you're a competent creative person that can understand the data behind it, you've opened up a repertoire of options for yourself to make yourself
Right.
more effective.
Well, and even just teasing the muse, because I try to explain to maybe business folks who are not so much on the creative side. I mean, there are business people who are creative as well. Some people say it's left brain, right brain, whatever the case may be. Some people are naturally creative. Some people are naturally diligent and focused. There are all sorts of different personalities. But creativity requires fuel. It requires energy. And what I think is really cool about these new Gen AI tools is they can be used to spark your own creativity because the Gen AI tools, they're just giving you the average of what they've found. And so it's going to be kind of generic. But sometimes it can help to use that just to trigger your thought process and find the idea, right? It's like finding a needle in a haystack. Well, that if you have a magnet, that's good. Otherwise, you're going to poke yourself. Oh, I found it. And that hurts. But the point is that you can use these tools to kind of gin up your own creativity and get rolling, right?
Absolutely. And even just thinking about A/B testing and creative testing, you can start to get that signal at a much better fidelity and start to test out what's working to fuel further creative ideas. It's not about replacement, it's not about replacing creativity. Like we said, I think last time, um, we're talking about a very sophisticated pattern matching technique with AI
Mm,
typically. And I
yeah.
think coming back to that, that will never replace pure creativity and pure emotion. Um, and really, truly at our core, and I think at most creatives' core, we need to realize that and utilize the tools that we have in place to further our aptitude to making better decisions, making more data-informed decisions.
Hmm. Yeah, it's all about the measurement. What gets measured gets managed. So you start paying attention to it. I've been doing tracked email marketing for 25 years because a friend of mine built a solution back in 2000 before you had all these other sort of SaaS solutions out there like eye contact or constant contact. And I got to tell you, once you can see the numbers, once you know what's happening, you cannot go back into the darkness. Right? You're like, all right, I got to see what's happening, even though, like I say, a lot of it has to be normalized. It has to be tempered, taken with a grain of salt. But still, once you start looking at the numbers, you get addicted to looking at the numbers, right?
Oh yeah, it's and again like closing the loop. I think there's opportunities to abstract some of the challenges with looking at numbers. We do a lot of work in the measurement space as well. We do a lot of regression analyses, a lot of mixed media modeling.
Mm,
What we've found really interesting is bringing those opportunities back into a natural language interface, bringing those opportunities back into a place where it can be explained in simple English so that you can cut down some of the barriers, bringing together the creativity, bringing together those that haven't had access to the data before, and fueling that further democratization, I think is an interesting path and something that's sometimes a little overlooked in the tech industry where we're racing to deploy models, we're racing to just show the shiny object, but some of the
right.
simple use cases have really helped land an impact with the CMO or close the gap between the CMO and the CTO in some organizations as well. So super
Interesting.
interesting area of that we've dove into. And I think as we start thinking about AI as a concept, the whole idea of modularity in the marketing stack, and you mentioned email being one that's been heavily inundated with data and very, very like one-to-one manner. I think we're seeing that with um the notion of composability in the marketplace, the idea of gluing together fit for purpose elements, having your data warehouse, having essentially a layer
Hmm.
of data where you can construct it, and the infrastructure behind it as well.
Right. Right. Use the data to make the decisions. I mean, we've talked about this for 30 years now, but it's getting much, much easier. Technologies like Snowflake and Databricks are obviously leading the charge there. But there are lots of ways that you can leverage your own enterprise data. Do so responsibly. Don't dump your enterprise data, your IP, into an open source large language model or a large language model that's external to your organization. You can be very careful about that stuff. That's why you have all these RAG models. That's why you have Graph. There are lots of ways to solve that issue. But folks, don't touch that dial. The podcast bonus segment is coming up next. We're talking to Mikey Watson. We'll be right back. All right, time for the podcast bonus segment, folks, with Mikey Watson of Monks. We're talking all about agentic workflows, artificial intelligence, when to use it, how to use it. And you mentioned something very interesting there at the end of that last segment, Mikey, about closing the gap between the chief marketing officer and the chief technology officer, for example, or chief data officer. That is just so crucial. I'm so encouraged to hear you say that because you understand these people are on a team. You guys need to be talking to each other. And if you look at the troubles that occur in organizations, I would say probably 7 times out of 10, it's bad communication. 2 or 3 times out of 10, it could be misalignment. It could be a troublemaker. I mean, there are people who act for reasons other than truly beneficial to the business. I'll just put it that way, right? That does happen, but usually it's just communication. And something I learned, gosh, about 20 years ago from a really good consultant, Maureen Clary was her name, from Connect the Knowledge Network at a TDWI conference. She said something I thought was fascinating. She said, top down and bottom up communication usually works pretty well. It's across. So your directors or your VPs, or to a certain extent the C-suite, because what you don't want are a bunch of fiefdoms. You want these people talking to each other. And like at that VP director level, especially across departments, marketing talking to the data team, talking to the IT team, just know what's going on in those environments, in part because you don't want to reinvent the wheel, but in part because this, how do they put it? It's like a whole team effort, or there's a term I'm not getting right now, but basically with this movement towards AI and especially agentic. I mean, large language models is one thing. Agentic AI workflows, that's another whole thing entirely. And that's still very immature. I think there's a lot of talk about that, but I'm still pretty skeptical at just how far you can push that. You have to keep it kind of quarantined in this little box and keep it very focused on what it's supposed to do and monitor the daylights out of that stuff. But my point is that we are entering an epoch. This is the AI epoch. It was the information age. Now it's the AI epoch. And you want your full team to be talking about this, planning, and engaged on a regular basis, right, Mikey?
Absolutely. And I think this is where MarTech has been super interesting for us.
Ooh,
And
yeah.
we've seen it kind of gone full circle. If you think about the classical CMO approach, it was fragmented. You had so many platforms. You had platform after platform. Every couple of years, you'd bring in a new platform. Every couple of years, you would have to make that capital expense. You would have to justify each one of these individual platforms. But bringing it back full circle, and from the CTO's perspective, they're talking about long-term commitments to cloud providers. They're talking about long-term technology commitments. So there's always been this kind of gap in between. And what's been pertinent for us during these discussions is like, how do we make sure that we're building solutions that cover both sides of the coin? Because inherently there's value in data that's been typically controlled, like you said, Eric, around the CTO or the chief data officer, depending on the organization. How do we start utilizing that best asset and building structures around that to essentially bolt on fit for purpose tools in this modular world that we're living in, especially under AI? If we think about the agentic approach, we're talking about a core set of data and aligning across the board to have that data feed into our models, that data closing the loop between some of our performance analysis, that data fueling the creative. And central to all of those conversations is the bridge between the CMO and the CTO from our perspective.
I realized I was on mute there. In any good organization, you're going to have those conversations. You want those conversations because the only way you stay on top of things, I mean, that's kind of how the agentic stuff works too. It wants recent information. It wants to have a recency bias. What is the most relevant data now? Because it probably was different yesterday or the day before. And so you want those conversations because, folks, I'm telling you, the things are moving so fast. I mean, just to give a quick anecdote, on our show, DM Radio, we used to plan out the entire year for the editorial calendar because the world was somewhat static. We can't do that anymore. I mean, we can kind of plan out a little bit, but you never know what's going to happen. These models come out and they change everything. Claude, I got a buddy who's a really, really dense full stack developer, and he's telling me Claude that for coding is crazy. It works so fast. You can have multiple things going. Now you still have to stitch it together. You still need the person to go, okay, we're going to put this component in with that component, and then we're going to roll with this. Don't don't turn over control. Don't ever let agentic AI run the company. That's when you'll run into some real trouble. But the key is to have people talking to each other. And what's cool about the marketing side is, look, I talked to a guy the other day. He said something. I love this. He goes, "Sales fixes everything." I'm like, "Yeah, you're right. It does. Sales fixes everything. Marketing helps sales, and then operations has to step in to deliver what the salesperson sold based upon the marketing." So it's a team effort. And these days, for like product design, for example, CPG, all that stuff, those cycle times are much tighter than they used to be. I mean, it used to be like a year or 2 years, like from ideation to distribution. Now it's like down to 3 months sometimes if you do it right. And that's the key, right? Closing thoughts from you, Mikey.
Absolutely. And not to go full circle back into the technology, but I think coordination is the key here. The gap between organizations is getting smaller, or different operations in your organization is getting much smaller. I hope with AI, there's a understanding of those different roles because data is so much more accessible.
Yeah.
Then a shared empathy of, if we're driving sales, we're doing this together, we're driving innovation inside of our organization and utilizing the tools and the data to our best of our ability. The whole organization is going to be uplifted by that. And I think really we're seeing total innovation, total change inside of these organizations where different roles that were historically spread apart are getting much closer together.
Yeah. Wow, it's just wonderful. It's good stuff. It's so much fun because look, when morale drops at organizations, it is a result of friction points that are not addressed. If there's a friction point that is not addressed, guess what happens? Like it'll ruin a car engine, it'll ruin your bicycle, it'll ruin everything. That's why you have oil, lubricant in there to kind of keep it running smoothly. Friction points will wear you down, and AI can help you find those friction points, but you have to talk to each other. The lubrication in companies is communication. It is talking to each other so you know, and being candid with people. Don't BS people, don't gaslight people. Tell them what you're thinking and what's going on. The truth will set you free. Well, folks, look this gentleman up online, Mikey Watson of Monks. Very cool company. I could tell they really know their stuff. And if you need some help with all that MarTech and AI, that's who you want to talk to. And send me an email if you want to be on the show, info@insideanalysis.com. We'll talk to you next time. You've been listening to Inside Analysis.